Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Joining me today is Dr. Borko Rodic. Borko and I are going to be discussing a variety of considerations relating to physical therapy and manual therapy with an emphasis on thinking beyond the physical component of it. Borko draws quite a bit from his own past journey and past experiences. He's one of the most unique individuals I've met, and I really appreciate him sharing his journey with us today, from how he got involved in physical therapy from a very young age, studying it in high school in Europe, to some unfortunate events that happened in his home country, and how that shaped the person that we know him as today. Really appreciative of Borko's time, and Borko's journey is one that I believe will have a very lasting impact on you. Enjoy. Borko, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. Thanks for being here.
Well, I very much appreciate you having me. Thanks for reaching out, and I'm glad to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, and I've been thankful to, you and I have shared some mutual connections, and you and I was able to learn from you when you were back at LVC there a few years ago. And I've noticed that you're very good at what you do, and you do a lot of different things, Borko. For people who might not know you as well as I do, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Oh, absolutely. So currently, I'm an assistant professor at Messiah University. We have a newly accredited physical therapy program. So there, on a daily basis, I teach most of the research courses, and I also teach manual therapy courses and musculoskeletal type material. So I've been there for almost 4 years now. Prior to that, I was an adjunct at LVC, and that was the connection we had.
Yeah, definitely. And you've been practicing PT during that time yourself too, as well, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, my beginning exposure to physical therapy actually starts in Europe. So I was born and raised in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and there, in many parts of Europe, you actually can pick your profession pretty early on if you know
Really?
what you're interested. And so, for example, I went to a medical high school with physical therapy major at a high school level. So that was me in 2001, and right around the time graduating from high school, I immigrated to the United States. That's related to some unfortunate events in the 90s in former Yugoslavia. So my city, Sarajevo, was under siege, and there was a tremendous disaster and tragedy that occurred. But fortunately, I and my family are fine, and we were able to get out of there. We got out of there 5 years after the war. But then I carried this passion for physical therapy from Europe to the United States. Certainly, the educational system is different. So, what we have here as a doctor of physical therapy doesn't necessarily exist in those parts of Europe. Usually, how it's set up is that a physiatrist or somebody who went through medical school and then got specialized in physiotherapy would be the gatekeeper. So they would be the ones doing the exam and setting up the plan, but then you have physios that would deliver that plan of care. So it's almost like there's an in-between of an assistant and a doctor of physical therapy. And those would be some of the physios that I encountered in Europe. So when I try to explain what I currently do, it doesn't always compute.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's a very unique upbringing for the world of physical therapy. And it's always interesting to me to hear about the differences within the profession in the US versus other parts of the world. And I want to say that I'm sorry to hear about the unfortunate events that occurred back in the 1990s for you and your family there, Borko. But I'm glad to hear that you guys made it out on, the brighter side of gray, we'll call it. And it sounds like you've been really able to kind of take the world by storm ever since then.
Well, what was interesting is that my biggest obstacle really was I didn't speak English. So my first classes in the United States were ESL type of classes at a community college. What wasn't hard is some of the anatomy, physiology, and all the background knowledge that I accumulated while I was in Europe. And to be honest, the education, although it has some subjectivity and some things that we wouldn't consider fair here, do make you a really tough, resilient student. And clinical reasoning in that sense also is pretty strong. So that's what I carried with me. So when I was here, that was the first time that I got a multiple choice exam. And I was thinking, you're telling me one of these answers is the correct one and all I got to do is pick it? No problem. Over there, a lot of it is unannounced, impromptu oral examination, on the spot and then in front of your peers, which would be unheard of in our settings here.
That is very unique. And that was at the high school level for you, you said.
Yeah, exactly. So we had Latin, we had medical Latin, we had a lot of anatomy and physiology, and then we had exposure to patients in clinics.
Interesting.
All at the high school level, yes.
Was there anything around exercise or manual therapy or anything like that in there as well?
Yes, I mean, we had classes that would teach us how to do those things. Although I would say, of course, the clinical reasoning component wasn't really developed at that time. So you didn't necessarily have the examination skills. You had more treatment delivery skills.
So what exactly made you know from a very young age in high school that you wanted to go into physiotherapy? Because I've talked with and worked with a lot of high schoolers in the past that are very on the fence about things, not really sure. They're kind of between 5 different things. So how did you know that was what you wanted to do?
Well, it was pure luck, but in a way it came from a story similar to many other physical therapists here, which is I got injured playing soccer and I had some physical therapy myself, and I got involved in the profession from a consumer point of view. That got me interested in that. And then I was also pretty strong in sciences as far as those foundational skills that you have to be a successful therapist. So, a lack of getting injured in a way completely shifted my career in this direction.
Yeah, that's interesting. What was your experience like as a patient in the European physical therapy model?
I was just in high school trying to get back on the soccer field. I don't know that I have anything special in terms of my insights. I got a few basic ortho issues that got better. Some of them got better with the natural course of the disease. So, but just that environment of the clinic and seeing the patients getting in and getting better, that kind of stuff, that piqued my interest. I had compassion for care and for service.
Yeah, I like that. Was that model that they were using? I know you talked a little bit briefly about the difference in levels of PT and how, in America we have the PT, the PTA, and that sort of thing. Was there a huge difference you feel between how PT care was delivered and how patients were treated in Europe versus what we do here in America?
Well, this is, and I have to be fair to put a disclaimer, this is at the time of the early 2000s. I think profession over there also evolved over time. So
Right.
I think they added some levels to fill those gaps in between. So some of my colleagues still in Europe are able to examine and treat the patient. That was lacking at the time. So in other words, where you get the exam isn't where you get treated. There was a complete disconnect of the examiner with the person delivering care. And that was really that's the beauty that we have here. We have the patient, we have autonomy to examine the patient and treat them how we think we need to treat them. Of course, we have our own obstacles of all the other components, confounding factors, third-party payers, and everything else that comes in to potentially limit our clinical decisions. But at the very least, you can amend your treatment as you please, as long as it's for patients' best interest.
Right. That's interesting. There's this theme I've noticed as I've started to talk with individuals such as yourself over the past couple of years, Borko, where, I've found a lot of people who are highly successful and highly skilled at what they do faced a rough period of times or some kind of challenges. You kind of explained it as the obstacle in the path that you faced when you're in the 90s over there. How do you feel that the challenges that you faced on a culture standpoint at the time, and moving to America, learning a new language, and just kind of really almost hitting the reset button in a way, if you will, how do you feel like that helped shape you into the person that you are today?
Well, I think that's at the core of who I am. It really redefines what a problem is. So what I went through, I really honestly wish nobody goes through. And if they understand how I feel or what I mean, that would mean that they went through some really rough times. So therefore, I really don't mind if they don't know where I'm coming from. But at the same time, not to minimize everyday life struggles when life isn't threatened, those are the comparisons I had. You have snipers on the streets versus you have a rough scheduling day in the clinic. It's not really comparable. So I think it recalibrated how I think of life and how blessed I am to be here. And at the same time, kind of take that resilience and toughness into just tackling problems. I have this thing where whatever would happen during my day, I almost immediately think of one positive thing that is associated of how this could change that situation. So most of the time, I have minimal amount of stress and I'm able to conquer the day. So far, I've been successful in that.
Right. It's
But
almost
at the same time, I want to say I don't want to minimize people's problems. If I consider their problem on a scale of potential human problems to be on the lower end, that doesn't mean it's small for them. I have to say that it's just that that's what I think of how it would affect me. But I definitely can relate, and I'm empathetic to really any situation that people are going through, because it's their perception of that problem. It's not my point of view.
right, right. I think that's a great point too, is, you know, you can never really feel what someone else is feeling in the moment. You can't just put their shoes on and walk around in them for a while, and you never really know what someone has been through in the past and how that has shaped them into the person that they are today. And I feel like that's something that's often forgot about in the world of physical therapy. You know, we often emphasize the physical part of it. You know, well, you know, a patient has pain, it's got to be physical, it's got to be mechanical in nature. You know, there's got to be
Yes.
something I can do with my hands to make it feel better, when sometimes there's deeper things contributing to it, or there's a lot more to the story. And I think the more we look into that and the better we get at learning about someone, the more effective we'll be as providers at treating them for the things they're coming to see us for.
Well, that's an excellent point. In fact, in medical literature, holistic care to overall health is evident that it's beneficial. So beyond the physical, what is the other components of health? And it would be mental and spiritual aspects. And there is some research that physical therapy perceptions on not only physical, but let's say spiritual component to health are also important to them. The problem is that no physical therapist, well, I would say minority of them would feel that they're the ones to address those components of what the person thinks would need. Harold Koenig is a Duke University professor. He's published a lot of in psychology on this exact topic of what does one think is important for their health beyond the physical. And in a way, my newer line of research beyond the manual therapy would want to look into this as well. I would want to ultimately have some kind of outcome measure that would explore that during your first encounter with the patient. So that is to say, regardless of your own background as the physical therapist, you'd want to at least know, is this patient in need of something more than physical aspect of health? And let's say that it is, then the question becomes, are those needs satisfied? So if they have spiritual needs and they're struggling with something, or maybe there's depression or some bigger story, do they need help in that situation? And then if the answer is yes, that would mean that you as a physical therapist at the very least could maybe be a referral source to the professional that could address those needs. That doesn't mean that you as the physical therapist need to address them. But we do have a lot of patients coming through direct access, and we're the gatekeeper.
Right.
So yes, I agree. We focus on the physical, we focus on the hardware, and it turns out software is part of it. So the neurophysiological component to the story, and then there are other components of health, and they're not only physical.
Yeah, no, definitely. I completely agree with that. And that's an interesting point there too, on having some way to assess all aspects of health very quickly initially. I think a lot of times we feel like we need to do everything ourselves, or at least I felt that way in the past. And maybe that's just me being who I am personally. felt like there's a time and a place you feel like you're almost got to be like the outlaw in the story, like the one who just does it all and throws it all on the back and just keeps moving forward. But I very quickly learned the value in making connections with other individuals, other professionals, and creating almost like a inner network type of system, if you will, where when someone comes in with an issue, I can kind of like send them to the most appropriate person, who more often than not is not myself. And I'm happy to play, whatever role needs to be played in the situation. But I feel like we almost need to take a slight step back and realize like the patient is the most important person in the relationship. And if we don't prioritize them and their needs, then, we're doing them a huge disservice. At the end of the day, it's not about how many people you see. I know some businesses are going to hate me for saying this, but it's not about how many people you see. It's not about, just how many you get better on your own. It's about overall, how do all of the patients improve? And, what role did you play in that? And maybe that role is just one visit and you send them to someone else. And maybe that role is a full plan of care. But whatever role it is and whatever you do, I think you have to do it well and know what you can do and can't do.
Absolutely. Those are the relationships that occur with your patients that last potentially for months and years. So if you didn't get whatever productivity number your company might impose on you, that's a short-term effect. If you look at that relationship long-term, I think it's gonna eventually far supersede whatever you would get out of doing things when you shouldn't do them, or doing them too often, or not tapering down and not empowering the patients to get better on their own and not making them dependent on you. But yes, in fact, I do think that what you just said makes complete sense.
How do you go about when you're working with someone? Because I know you've mentioned to me in the past, you've got a very heavy background in manual therapy. And I know you've got a lot of skill when it comes to interventions, but I've noticed a big part of manual therapy is not just doing the intervention, but knowing who to do it on, where to do it on, which one to do, that sort of thing. So how do you go about taking all these different considerations that we've discussed so far, Borko, and putting it together into a treatment for one of your patients?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also I would add to that when not to do manual therapy. Maybe that's the first step. So I look at it at first, you have to triage the patient and understand, are you the person that could help them? Are you the person that could help this condition and get them to reach their ultimate goal and the outcome they desire? So for me, it really starts with the patient and their expectations and the goals. Then a thorough interview and exam would get you to the point of understanding where is the patient function and where is the patient's expectations and goals, and what is the gap between the two. So I look at myself as really just the bridge between those two things. In other words, if the patient's current function is at this level, but they want to do activity X at that level, I need to figure out how to connect the dots to get them there. So on that bridge, on that road, and on that path, manual therapy is simply just one ingredient. I don't think the manual therapy is the answer to every patient and every condition. I think that it needs to be used in and with other things, in other words, as an adjunct to everything else you do. So I really just look at it as one of the tools we have, and we certainly have other tools in our toolbox that we need to employ. So this constant battle and pinning techniques against each other in research with potentially poor methodology, then concluding that one of these techniques is no good, I don't think it really serves the patient or our profession. So there's some definite issues with demonization of manual therapy as it's been popular in the last years. Not looking at the whole picture and really not looking at how it's typically used in the clinic.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because, as you mentioned, looking at the whole picture, we often, or at least at one point, we thought of manual therapy as a biomechanical construct of, oh, well, I'm going to move the joint this way and this thing is going to happen, which makes sense. But I feel like from what I've seen lately from individuals such as, you, Mike Lair, Brett Windsor, is it seems to be more of a neurophysiological construct to what we're doing with our hands and the effect we're having. And I feel like that's something we don't fully understand yet as to, how manual therapy does what it does. And it's interesting to me because, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot more to someone than just the physical side. There's all these other considerations. And the same holds true with manual therapy for that sense. It's not just the physical, it's not just the mechanics, the movement. It's sometimes more of a neurophysiological thing. And to give an example of that, as you mentioned, it's important to know who to do it with versus not to do it with. But there have been certain individuals who they didn't have a movement or mobility restriction at all. In fact, some of them had cases where there was too much movement, but there were certain manual things I was able to do to get them feeling a lot better in a very short amount of time. So, if we're just looking at it at a mechanical construct, hey, maybe I shouldn't have done soft tissue work. Hey, maybe I shouldn't have done any kind of, low grade mobilization because there's so much movement already. But by the same token, if someone feels better and that effect lasts for a long period of time, and we can open up a window to do exercise and other things that will help them maintain that improved state long term, why wouldn't I do it?
Exactly. Well, most people are familiar with Bialowski's work and the theory that he proposed, and it still is a theory, but it probably is the best working theory of connecting all potential mechanisms of why manual therapy works, or how, if it does work, how it potentially works. What unfortunately happens is people try to get a simple answer on its surface without looking at the full story. And then they would just pick one part of that theory to say it is not a mechanical thing, and then that's not what happens, and then get stuck there. Or they say it's all software, it's all neurophysiology. It really is, when you look at that theory, it's all three different pathways that could happen that potentially work, and then sometimes one of those could be more dominant, and other times it's something else. It kind of depends on the patient and the condition and irritability and what you kind of input through their system with some afferent input with manual therapy. So in a way, I do think that occasionally biomechanical things make sense, and it probably is the hardware, and we are pushing and pulling and tractioning and compressing on their tissues, and that can have a mechanical input with a mechanical outcome. But clearly, it's been demonstrated that that's not every time and not for everybody. Whereas some other cases, it could be more the software behind that story. So that's how I look at it. I don't know that there's an answer that explains every patient and every condition with your input that is kind of saying this is why that patient is or isn't better. In fact, there's enough evidence to know that pain has so many aspects and so many domains. And really, in terms of anatomy, pain is correlated to tissue damage only in the beginning of the story. So for example, you break something, it hurts at that site. We know the pain is from those areas. But if you take a look a year later, whatever pain is there at that time, well, patient still has pain, but it's not potentially from that cause, right? So pain is behavioral, pain is cultural. There are many aspects that influence it. So I would say we need to scratch deeper than the surface and understand that mechanisms are more than one pathway and they are not evenly utilized every time. But to say that this whole new attempt to demonize therapy should be valid and it should be to the point of excluding manual therapy from patient care, I think is several steps ahead, and it's damaging ultimately really to the patient.
I would have to agree with that statement, Borko. I think there's a lot of value and power in manual therapy, and it's one of those things that I don't think every PT needs to be the best at it, in the sense of I don't think every single PT ever needs to go through an entire fellowship program in order to have effective things from manual therapy. it'd be helpful, it'd be great, but I don't think it's realistic at the end of the day. And
Well,
I, I
I would say that's absolutely correct. In fact, there's enough studies that say that you don't even have to be specific to do some manual therapy in terms of producing the desired outcome. But again, even that becomes a deeper discussion,
yeah,
because I would say, yes, there are times when you don't have to be specific and you are going to produce some short-term outcomes that could be great for the patient needs. But at the same time, there are some patients when a non-specific approach will not produce outcomes and a specific approach is needed. So
right,
for example, if something's irritable in the spine and there's areas where you want to address potential mobility problems, but you put enough force, too much force, too non-specific force to kind of stir up the whole system, certainly then what's going to happen is you addressed things that are already moving. And those are the things that would move first. So it would just be a matter of, in a sense, physics. So the thing that's already going to move is going to move first.
right. So it's kind of like adding fuel to the fire, if that makes sense. Like if you aren't properly assessing, if you aren't targeting your treatment specifically with those certain individuals, you almost add to the problem instead of resolve it.
I think for me, you can produce a good outcome with less force, with less potential irritability to the patient. And it can protect some areas for certain patients that really don't need, they need some areas to be left alone in a way so that you can focus in on that. So again, yes, there's times when non-specific approach is fine, but I do think that there are some individuals that is not good enough, and we can be good enough to be more specific. So I don't know why you wouldn't be specific if you can be. If you then are not, you're still okay. There's
right.
really there's no negative effect to that, other than maybe saying it takes time and it potentially costs money to get that. But yeah, I don't think everybody needs to be a manual certified physical therapist to do some really effective manual therapy. That is absolutely the case.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you brought up the point of, not everyone, but most people, I'll say, and I don't have a stat or an article to back this up, but most people improve with general manual things. Like, if I have a shoulder I need to get moving, me doing a grade 2 versus a grade 3 on the Maitland scale is probably not going to make a huge difference. And I honestly kind of mix it up and do a little bit of both. So I think that there's plenty of value in what we do from that standpoint. And like we've talked about, the value comes from so many different areas. And I think one of the most overlooked ones, as you mentioned earlier, was actually the cultural influence. And there was an example that comes right to mind from my past year treating here, actually, is I do a lot of soft tissue myofascial cupping techniques. And that's something that I've gotten very comfortable with, gotten, a lot of familiarity with. And there was an individual I was working with who actually specifically requested it for their issue because it was part of their spiritual practice. And, Dan from small town, middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, had never really seen that before, had been exposed to that before. So it was kind of like a eye-opening kind of case for me, but it was incredible to me how, someone's cultural and, religious background impacted their plan of care and treatment. And I started doing something by request, and it was amazing to see how a problem that I thought was going to take a lot longer to get better actually got really, really good, really, really quick. So as you mentioned before, it's always interesting to see how some of those often overlooked factors can impact what we do from a manual standpoint and the outcome we get from them. And as I mentioned, I think that's an area that we could all learn more from.
Sure. Well, you bring up two important points, maybe even three, but the two of them pertain to evidence-based practice. Because what happens is we establish the definition of evidence-based practice, and we have those three pillars that state it is clinical expertise, and it is the patient values, and as well the literature, right? But then what we did is we simply focused only on the literature and excluded the other two in these discussions. So what happens is you give it equal value, but then when these discussions happen, we only discuss the literature component of the story, and that should not be. We would not have literature if we didn't have the patient values and the clinical expertise in the first place. So should you do something that, like you described, works for you and your patients, and you have utilized it successfully and your outcomes are good and the patient satisfaction is great, and you're saving medical costs to the whole system and to the patient, should you then not use that if there's not a randomized controlled trial that will really delineate the cause and effect, that your outcome is produced only because of using those treatment techniques? I think that's a problem. You should be able to have expertise and treat the patients that the way you want to treat, because you're getting the outcomes you're getting. And at the same time, patient comes to you with a certain amount of preconceived ideas about what you can do for them with previous experiences, and they know what has worked for them, and then is asking you to assist them in that story. But then for you to say that I will never do any of those things because I don't have, again, a really solid randomized controlled trial to justify it, it also becomes problematic. At the same time, you can't completely give up control and only do what your patients desire, because sometimes what they desire may not be what is medically necessary, and in the long term it may not be in their best interest. So you have to balance that. All three of those have to be balanced and constantly checked against each other so that you can get the right recipe.
So you mean to tell me my patient coming in and asking for ankle manipulation techniques to fix their shoulder pain might not be necessary?
So I'll tell you one example I had early on in my career. I remember this case. It was a patient with low back pain. It was chronic low back pain and previous history of a disc problem. And the patient says, I need you to please do that prickly electrical thing, because I can feel how that is pushing my discs back in place. So that's the real case and a real story. So, and then what's your approach as the clinician? I think everybody should reflect on that story and see how they would navigate that. One approach would be, no, sir, that does not work. That is not what happens. You can't have that. There's no evidence for that. I won't give it to you. And then probably what's going to happen is that patient will go somewhere else, right? Or you might do more damage in a sense. At the same time, you could say yes and agree, but then the patient is dictating your treatment. So what needs to happen is something in between. You need to respect that there's patient values, and that if he thinks that this type of approach, although it's not proven in literature, can help the patient, guess what? It really could help. So that leads us to the story of the placebo effect, because placebo effect is a real effect. When you look at most studies on biophysical agents and modalities, we certainly did a good job of devaluing any use of modalities for our patients. Then later on, we complain that we're not getting reimbursed for it. When you look at those results, most likely they say that all the groups get better, even the placebo control group, but the intervention group doesn't get more better than the placebo. So therefore we shouldn't use it. And then what we don't use is, we don't use the placebo or that intervention. So that's a methodological problem. And maybe we need to embrace the placebo effect, balance it in this whole complex story of the patient care, and then utilize it when it makes sense. And that just is another part of evidence-based practice. It is not necessarily living in the literature.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an interesting point as well on the placebo effect, because again, it's something where I think we often think everything we do has to have rhyme, reason, and rationale to it. And sometimes we go a little deep on that. And sometimes the whole rationale behind what we're doing and why can literally just be, well, it's going to help my patient. My patient feels it's going to help them, so I'm going to do it. We don't have to
Yeah.
get too fancy with it sometimes. So I like that approach. I'm going to flip it a little bit and say, what if your patient doesn't want you to do certain things? So say there's a cultural factor or something along those lines, and they're not going to let you put hands on them at all because of that. And you can't do any manual thing. They're against modalities. How does your approach change for that kind of conversation?
Well, if that's what they feel, then I will not put my hands on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In fact, one of the contraindications to manual therapy is that if they're afraid of it, have some apprehension about it, or for whatever reason don't want it, then you should not push them toward that, because you're entering a dangerous territory of any adverse effect, whether you're the reason for it or not. Certainly will be part of that mix. In patient's mind, you're going to be the ones that potentially had something to do with that. So I certainly had cases where I know that if we're just talking condition and the exam findings with paired intervention, I know that what they would qualify for, and I know that the right intervention for this setup would be that I possess it, I have, and I know what to do. For example, moving and manipulating something in the CT junction area. But if they're apprehensive about it, I don't do it. I find something else to do.
I think that's a great point, and that's something that I've seen as a growing issue myself, where I feel like certain clinicians have almost become like a salesperson, if you will, to push people into certain things, like, whether that be spinal manipulation, whether that be dry needling or whatever. I've seen cases where, I've worked with people who felt pressured into something by the clinician that they were working with. And to me, that's, unless it's a specific example, like take ACL rehab and you need to get extension range of motion back post-op. Well, unfortunately, you're going to have to prop the heel. You're going to have to push on it a little bit. You're going to have to squeeze the quad. Some of those things are necessary evils for certain things. But when it comes to the manual therapy world of certain types of manipulation, dry needling, I'll even throw cupping, scraping, and other soft tissue techniques in there as well. I don't always feel like they're essential depending on the patient. And I don't always feel like we should be the ones to sell them on a certain intervention. I think if anything, we should educate them on it. And then, kind of like you mentioned before, let people come to their own conclusions on it. So what I mean by that is I've offered spine manipulation, or I've offered scraping or cupping or whatever to people in the past who were apprehensive at first, and said, look, I want you to think about it. And next time you come in, we'll talk about it and we'll go from there. And maybe they're keen on trying it and we do it and it gets better. And maybe they don't want to try it and we modify and adjust, and that's okay. But, to your point before about having a patient dictate treatment, I don't think they should be the primary driver, but I definitely think it's important for them to at least be able to have a hand on the wheel when it comes to some of these things, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. So if you're talking patient-centered care, they really should be in the driver's seat, but they should just have ability to have directions of where to go. And those directions really come from our patient education. What I was trying to say earlier is that if they're driving off a cliff, you need to tell them that there is a cliff and they are going to drive into it. So in that sense, you need to maybe, help them steer the wheel a little bit. But for sure, it should not be about the therapist. We shouldn't have this arrogance and coaxing them into only doing what we think is the best for them. We should tell them what's on the menu, and then why certain things can help, and what would be the pros and cons for each thing. And this is not just for manual therapy. This is just for anything really that we do, and then help them make that decision.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I like how you use the menu analogy there, Borko. That's clever. Big fan of that. What other things, if you had to take away, like, say, 2 lessons from, your past several decades of physical therapy experience, ranging from where you were in high school to where you are today, do you have any kind of key takeaways or pieces of advice that you would offer to the next generation?
Well, I think our profession has a bright future, but it also does have some problems. I think when I was a student, just trying to do right by my patient, be the best clinician I can be, I didn't necessarily have the vision of the whole profession and the landscape of our health in this in this country. So what I don't think is getting better is I don't think that we're doing a really good job of explaining what we do, not just to general public, but even to the medical community. So I don't think we're any closer to being a part of medical team or a peer to some medical profession. I think that's a problem. I think we need to do a better job of selling our skills because so many benefits live there. First, if anything, and if we're not talking about the patient, which we always should, there's a tremendous cost saving to the whole system. So if and there are some studies that indicate if a PT is involved early on, and whether that's in emergency department or elsewhere as the triage person to screening medical musculoskeletal things, then those people don't need all the other things just to eventually get to therapy in the first place, right? But I think it would be great if some of the research, or if more research, focuses on what's the place of physical therapy in the healthcare system itself. We need to first establish that it should have a place. Its place is very valuable, and that seat should be equal seat to all other participants. Then we can discuss what we actually do and what to pick from all of the skills we have. But unfortunately, what we have is this bottom-up approach where we just start at the technique level and we say, is this better than this? And we have occasionally, if not frequently, poor methodology. And then we make some conclusions off of that. But it doesn't add to the big story. The big picture is what's happening on the level of the whole medical system. So really that may change with value-based practice. I'm not sure, but it certainly is slower than I anticipated. Or it could have been that I was just naive and not knowing how things work. So that's one side of the story. I would say I feel encouraged with new generations, and when I teach continuing education courses and some of the excitement in the DPT programs, I hope it doesn't fizzle out and that passion carries on. But it certainly has obstacles, and it'll take a lot more effort. As good as APTA is for us and all its all of the advocating they do, I still think, for medical professionals not to know that we do more than stretch a hamstring, it's a concern.
Yeah, I would have to agree with you there, Borko. And it's interesting. You've mentioned that, these are kind of the next obstacles for the profession moving forward. And kind of like we talked about at the beginning with your own personal story, Borko, the obstacle that was put in your path became the way forward. And while it led to a lot of challenges, and I'm sure a lot of long nights spent doing things that, you didn't know you were going to have to do, like learn a new language. I think ultimately that difficult road creates the most beautiful destination at the end of the day. So while, the profession might look at this and say, wow, this is a real steep mountain to climb. Wow, this is a very uphill battle. Like who's going to be alongside us fighting it, or who's got it in them to, climb this thing, or whatever analogy you want to throw at it. I think ultimately it comes back to individuals who have backstories such as yourself, of someone who was in a situation and found a way to overcome the odds and strive through adversity. And I think that the more we can remind ourselves of that, the more well-equipped we're going to be for our future moving forward.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, we live in a dynamic society and things do change every several years. So I'm hopeful. And I don't mean to be negative. I don't mean to say there aren't people that are working really hard on this exact question. But from a position of a clinician at a clinic, that story hasn't really shifted. We still need to establish our place. So despite the effort, we have to look at the outcome, and then it's really the outcome that dictates that there needs to be more effort.
Yeah, and not just more effort, but targeted effort, kind of like pulling
Right.
your terminology from manual therapy here. It's not enough to just go in blindly sometimes. Sometimes we have to be a little bit more specific. And that's something I've learned a lot myself over the past year and a half is I like to work hard, but sometimes it pays to work smart and not just work hard and burn the candle at both ends. And I think that's something that we all need to appreciate, as well as just being a little bit more methodical with some of these things long term, bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier how before you tried to handle everything yourself, and now you're getting to be wiser and you're able to delegate, refer, and collaborate with others. I think that probably is the recipe that should continue.
Amazing how quickly I can, it's amazing how quickly you can change course and kind of self-correct when you get in a situation where you're like, wow, I have no idea what I'm doing right now. Maybe those are the kinds of things I shouldn't share publicly, but I'm open, I'm honest, I'm transparent. I don't know everything. I'm not going to pretend to. And we're all just kind of continuing to learn and evolve at the end of the day.
I think if you're willing to admit and self-reflect things that you don't know and be transparent about that, that's the area of growth, and people will probably recognize that honesty. I don't think that I'm any different. There's many areas where I can be better at, and there's areas that I'm willing to say that I'm not an expert there, and let me just see where else we can get that information. So that's generally my approach. It's a lot less stressful, and it's a lot better for whomever you're trying to help.
Definitely. I completely agree with that, Borko. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in a short amount of time here today, Borko. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything we missed in our discussion today?
Well, I would just say certainly we started some interesting topics, and I think I appreciate all of the effort that you do, beyond treating patients, doing these kind of things. I'm not present on social media, and I don't share my or impose my opinions elsewhere. So this is probably the only avenue where somebody could get to hear my thought process. So that could be, if that's of benefit to anybody, I'm glad to participate. Appreciate all of the things you do, and I'm glad to see our students becoming excellent clinicians and then advocates for the profession. I think that's really remarkable.
I appreciate you, Borko. I know you mentioned you're not on social media. It's funny because I definitely would have picked you as like the MySpace generation, if nothing else. But for people,
I can share my story about social media, and really the answer why I'm not on there is maybe way more simple and not predictable to some. But what happened is I was promoted years ago to cover a clinic that I had interest in, but it wasn't as close to my house. Previously, I was a clinic manager at this one place where it was really close to where I lived. So then, as I'm getting ready to get to this new clinic, I caught myself scrolling up and down on the phone, realizing that I literally wasted 10, 15 minutes of my time, and I don't know how that time evaporated. I'll never get it back, and I could have done something better than that. And in that moment, I had this epiphany where I deleted whatever it was at the time. Could have been one of the things like Facebook. So then I had eliminated that from my phone, and then whatever next social media sensation occurred, I just chose to not participate in. I think it has benefits, and I think it can have great service to connect people and share stories. And unfortunately, it also can be part of the algorithm and a bubble that you can't escape from, and can carry all of the negative effects as well. So in a way, that's just what happened with me, and I'm very content. I don't feel like I'm missing any information. If anything crazy happens on Twitter, one of the family members can send me that link, and everything works just fine.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate and respect that approach, and it's something I've talked about with many individuals in the past. How I feel like in a way, many people become a slave to the screen, for lack of a better way to put it. And we get so lost and caught up in what we see online that our time literally just disappears on us. And I think at the end of the day, we need to find ways to reclaim control of that. And, you know, like anything, it's a tool. We can use it effectively, or we can overdo it and cause quite a bit of harm. Just like manual therapy. If we're not targeting,
yes, absolutely.
Everything is just like manual therapy today.
Well, the only notifications on my phone that can come through is a text message or a phone call. I have no other notification that can come through to tell me that I need to pick up my phone and look at it, unless I actively decide to do that myself. So that's not for everybody. That's just me and how I choose to spend my time. I have 3 young children and a busy family life that I'm trying to manage. So yeah, if that's helpful to anybody and they want to try it for a month, maybe do an experiment and see how it goes.
Priorities. I love that. I love that. But, you know, say someone listened in today and they're like, hey, you know, Borko Rodic, Messiah University, I want to find out more about that. Can they find you on like the Messiah website or anything like that?
Yeah, I do have a LinkedIn account. I do have all of my information on Messiah University website. So email is there in public, and I'm not in a bubble cocooned and not, you know, willing to communicate with people. I have people reaching out and me responding to them all the time. But I just prefer a phone conversation or a face-to-face meeting or something like this. So absolutely, it's possible to reach me, and that's where I'm at, I would say. Willing to engage in any productive project or collaboration that people have to suggest.
Yeah, that's awesome. We will link to that in the description below as well, so you can check out everything that Borko is doing over at Messiah University. Borko, it's been a pleasure, man. Great to catch up, and really appreciate your time and you sharing your story with us.
Well, thank you so much as well for having me, and we hope to catch up soon again.
Hey everyone, I want to take a second and tell you all about AliRx. AliRx is a at-home food sensitivity and gut health testing panel. You order online and then receive and complete your test at home for food sensitivities. You then receive a custom report online through your member portal, and then receive personalized recipes and supplements that are catered to you based on your food sensitivities. If this is something that interests you, you can check out the link and description in my bio, and you can use the coupon code capital D, capital B, RAUN, capital RX, so D Brawn RX, at checkout to save yourself 20%. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend, subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, and leave a review. This way we can spread knowledge and motivation and help reach more people. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.